It's Thursday, July 25th, and he says there's way more at stake than re-election. We start here.
I revere this office, but I love my country more.
In an Oval Office address, President Biden implores Americans to move on without him or his challenger.
For him, what is at stake right now with his own decision is the future of democracy.
He never said the name Trump, but this was all about the next election. We'll break down an emotionally charged night at the White House. On the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue, Benjamin Netanyahu stokes outrage.
America and Israel must stand together.
Some Democrats didn't even show up, while some that did made their feelings known. And these Olympics are controversial already. No, I'm not talking about Paris.
The United States cannot clean up sport by itself.
Why American organizers want to halt a doping investigation for the sake of the games. From ABC News, this is Start Here. I'm Brad Milkey. All Joseph R. Biden Jr. ever wanted to be was president of the United States. A lot of people don't remember this. He didn't just start running in 2008 against Barack Obama. He first ran for the White House in 1988.
This party better understand full well that it's about time we change our attitude.
Well, more than 30 years later, he achieved that dream. And you'd have to imagine, in his mind's eye, he envisioned himself as a two-term president. Every commander-in-chief does. Especially when the first couple years of your tenure are dominated by a pandemic. You want time to implement your longer-term vision for the country. Well, last night, in a historic reality check, President Biden told Americans directly for the first time out loud that he will not be seeking re-election.
It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think is more important than any title.
This was a primetime Oval Office address capping an absolutely bizarre 3-week span in which he has now handed over the reins of the party to his vice president. And yet, he is not resigning from office. He's still serving out his term. So what did he want Americans to take from this? Let's break it all down with ABC's White House correspondent Karen Travers. Karen, this was extraordinary stuff. Can you walk me through this address?
Brad, the president said that in recent weeks, it became clear that he needed to unite the Democratic Party in order to essentially save democracy.
I revere this office, but I love my country more.
And he said that means setting aside personal ambition.
So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation.
Brad, what he didn't say explicitly last night, but what he was certainly acknowledging was he was conceding that he finally recognized that he wasn't likely to win this race against Donald Trump, or it was going to be very difficult to win the race against Donald Trump.
He didn't step down from campaigning or from running because he didn't believe he can serve in a second term. That is not why.
The White House said yesterday, in response to a lot of questions, that this decision was not about his health. He wasn't stepping down because he didn't think he could do it for 4 more years. But he really was acknowledging last night the political reality that was happening.
You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
And Brad, I thought that was a very striking comment from the president because remember back in 2020 when he was campaigning, he talked about himself as a bridge candidate, not as anything else. He said there was another generation of leaders standing behind him who are the future of this country. He was really pitching himself as a transitional president. But that didn't happen when he said he was going to run for re-election. So for him to say last night that now is the time and place for fresh voices, younger voices, new voices. Yes, that is now the political reality he's facing. But I think there's still going to be a lot of people who say, why did it take you until July 2024 to realize that?
Yeah, I was going to say, when people talk about his legacy, you can imagine them not saying, he should have just stayed in the race. He would have beaten Trump. You can imagine them, though, saying, if Kamala Harris loses, you should have done it sooner. Mm-hmm. And Karen, it was interesting that he did it from the Oval Office because it's some place where I think of presidents declaring wars, talking about national security. And yet in his mind, it really did seem like when he talked about democracy, that he did see this as a national crisis moment, potentially.
The White House said he viewed this as a very serious, somber speech, that this was a historic moment and that deserved a setting like the Oval Office. You know, I think when we first heard from the president in the letter, when he announced he was no longer seeking re-election, and he said, "I will address the American people later this week and explain my decision," I think we all assumed it would be in front of a loud, boisterous, adoring crowd. Right. Let him walk in front of that room. You know, he feeds off the energy of a crowd. I mean, most people do, but especially Joe Biden. He loves that type of atmosphere. So, you know, we were a little surprised then to hear that he was doing it in the Oval Office. But then the way he laid it out last night of what is at stake right now, you could tell that he really viewed this on the same level as, like you mentioned, war and national security issues, that for him, what is at stake right now with his own decision is the future of democracy, and that is why he feels compelled to do this.
My record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy.
I mean, he still feels like he's got something to give and that he should get another 4 years. But the reality, you know, of what this moment was calling for, I think is why he sat down behind that desk last night and gave that very serious, sober address.
So what's next, Karen? Because, I mean, we're hearing some Republicans calling for Biden to step down now. He has rejected that. Did he detail what he plans to do, I guess, with these last 6 months of his term?
The president said he's going to focus on doing his job and getting things done for the American people. And some of the things he went through on his checklist include lowering costs for hardworking families, trying to continue growing the economy, defending personal freedoms and civil rights, also foreign policy. And frankly, that's probably where he has the better chance of having success because he's not working with Capitol Hill on that.
And I'm going to keep working to end the war in Gaza, bring home all the hostages, and bring peace and security to the Middle East and end this war.
And that's something he continues this week. He's meeting today in the Oval Office with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They'll also sit down with some of the families of the Americans held hostage. So that work continues. And I think for the president, that's also where he is usually most comfortable. National security issues, foreign policy issues. He is certainly going to kind of keep the foot to the pedal on that one over the next 6 months, and probably where he has the best chance of continuing to leave a mark over these next 6 months of his lame duck presidency.
Right, and you were telling us they actually had like 500 staffers on hand giving him like applause. This very much was a goodbye moment, and yet still a sort of, all right, I guess we got to get to work here, as the campaign arm of the Biden operation fully switches gears to Vice President Harris. Karen Travers, they're at the West Wing right now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad.
Next up on Start Here, Benjamin Netanyahu was facing his own angry electorate in Israel. Now he's facing ours too. We're back in a bit.
Introducing the ultimate bundle at an unbeatable price. The Disney Plus Hulu Max Bundle. With iconic entertainment like Loki and Encanto on Disney Plus.
I will save the magic.
FX is The Bear and the Kardashians on Hulu.
I am a good time, okay?
And The Last of Us and House of the Dragon on Max.
They are a protector of the road.
All available with the Disney Plus Hulu Max Bundle. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. Terms apply. Visit Disney Plus Hulu MaxBundle.com for details.
Whenever news breaks.
We are here in Israel, a nation at war.
In Rolling Fork, this tornado tore through this town.
From Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
From the scene of that deadly missile strike.
ABC News Live everywhere.
In Iceland, let's go.
On the 2024 campaign trail.
Here at 10 Downing Street.
Wherever the story is.
We're going to take you there.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live. Streaming free everywhere.
There are a few days in recent years where Washington has seemed electrified. The Women's March that began President Trump's term, and of course, January 6th as it ended. Yesterday had echoes of each of these days. The fervor, the crowds, the anger at times, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to town to appear before Congress, protests steadily seemed to build throughout the day. The public was not allowed inside the Capitol, but right outside, Capitol Police ended up deploying pepper spray to disperse people. At the Watergate Hotel, where Netanyahu was staying, protesters set loose maggots and crickets, anything they could do to make sure his delegation knew he wasn't welcome here. But eventually, Netanyahu did speak to this joint meeting of Congress, and he did not shy away from the controversy the war in Gaza has created. Let's go to ABC's Ali Pecorin, who covers the Capitol. She was there in the gallery as this speech unfolded. Ali, first off, this seemed like a charged day across Washington, right? What was it like inside the room?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the focus was these protests outside that you mentioned, but in the chamber, lawmakers were choosing to protest in their own unique ways. Before things got going, House Speaker Mike Johnson put out a letter telling his members that protests or disruptive protests were not going to be tolerated in this space. So what we ended up seeing in that room was some creative methods of protest, mostly from Democratic members, although not all, I should say. Leading up to Netanyahu's address, we heard members, mostly Democratic members, coming out and saying they were not planning on attending.
I don't think he should be here. I don't think Netanyahu should be here.
We saw at least 20 Senate Democrats skip the speech, probably more, and even more House Democrats chose to sit that out. That said, in the room, the chamber was almost entirely full. There were very few empty seats in the space. There was a lot of energy. Members who chose to protest did so more with their body language. We saw members who chose to stay seated during applause lines or be very selective about when they were going to clap.
Hey, and so then we get into the speech itself. What was the tone from this address from Netanyahu?
Yeah, Netanyahu definitely kicked off the speech trying to set a tone of unity. That was what he said he wanted to do. And he tried to do that by appealing to both sides of the aisle.
I want to thank President Biden for his tireless efforts on behalf of the hostages and for his efforts to the hostage families as well.
At varying points during the speech, we heard him thanking President Biden for his work in defending Israel, for his comments identifying as a Zionist, but he also thanked former President Donald Trump for his work in shoring up the Abraham Accords during his presidency.
I also want to thank President Trump for all the things he did for Israel, from recognizing Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, to confronting Iran's aggression, to recognizing Jerusalem as our capital and moving the American embassy there.
So early on, a lot of unity, bipartisanship, but he did not shy away from some of the topics that Democrats especially have been criticizing over the last few months as the conflict in Gaza has escalated. So we saw him at one point taking pretty direct jabs at protesters.
Some of these protesters hold up signs proclaiming gays for Gaza. They might as well hold up signs saying chickens for KFC.
And he did speak at the end a little bit about sort of the war in Gaza and what he envisions as the future for the conflict.
My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there to prevent the resurgence of terror, to ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
And at one point in the speech, he did entertain the idea of a ceasefire. He said those talks are ongoing, but he did not explicitly endorse one.
Well, I guess whether he accomplished his goals kind of depend on what you think his goals are, right? Like if it was to unite Americans in solidarity with Israel, maybe not. If it was to kind of tell the international community, tell the International Criminal Court, hey, I'm not going anywhere, and much of Washington and the U.S. agree with me, maybe it did. What was the reaction from lawmakers, I guess?
Yeah, to some extent, the answer to that question depends upon what side of the aisle you sit. Republicans in the room seemed very energetic about the speech. At all applause lines, they were standing up when hostages were introduced, guests of Netanyahu who he brought, or IDF soldiers that Netanyahu had introduced were introduced. Those earned wild applause from Republicans.
These heroes here today, the heroic soldiers of Israel, should not be condemned for how they're conducting the war in Gaza. They should be commended for it.
They were very, very enthusiastic about the speech. And Democrats at varying points were also enthusiastic. The bipartisan lines about the ongoing special relationship between Israel and the United States.
For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together.
Those were things that Democrats were pretty ready to get on board with. However, Some of the more divisive lines that we talked about, those are where Democrats had different forms of protests. But perhaps the most notable presence in the chamber was Representative Rashida Tlaib from Michigan. She's notably one of the only, if not the only, Palestinian Americans serving in Congress right now. And she remained seated through the entire address. But what she did do was hold up a small circular black and white sign. One side said guilty of genocide. The other said war criminal. She held up the sign and was otherwise silent throughout the speech. She was approached by members of the House floor staff at varying points and asked to put the sign down. Whenever she was approached, she did put the sign down. But it was certainly noticeable because she was really the only member who was doing an out-and-out protest on the floor. And Tlaib has certainly been very outspoken in her opposition to Netanyahu and Israel's offensive in Gaza.
Israel will always remain America's indispensable ally. Through thick and thin.
You know, Netanyahu's invitation to address Congress was a controversial one when it was extended initially by House Speaker Mike Johnson. There was some push and pull about whether Netanyahu ought to come here during this tumultuous time where the country's been a little bit fractured in its relationship with Netanyahu particularly. While the divide was a bit partisan, the number of Democrats that did choose to attend the speech shows that there is still an interest in preserving that relationship and in hearing Netanyahu out with Democrats.
Well, and meanwhile, you had Republicans who they invited Netanyahu here. So clearly their idea was to show that the entire Republican Party is united with the state of Israel and to perhaps put some Democrats in a more awkward spot. We'll see how this all plays out. But Ali Pecorin, there in the chamber as it happened and in the Capitol right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
We knew the Olympic Games were technically starting yesterday, but we weren't expecting a start like this. So the very first game of the very first tournament was men's soccer, Argentina versus Morocco. That game appeared to end with an absolute thriller of a goal. No time left on the clock. Everyone's going crazy, but then things get chaotic. Fans started running onto the field. Other fans started to throw things. At one point, players are seen ducking away from a flare. So authorities, fearing for safety, tell players to leave the field and they clear out the stadium. No more fans. Well, during this pause, referees discover that the goal in question was actually offside. They send the players back on hours later to play the last couple minutes in an empty stadium. Totally bizarre. At the same time, the women's soccer tournament has now been turned on its head by allegations of cheating. Canada has admitted they had a consultant fly a drone over practices, spying on their first opponent, New Zealand, trying to get an edge by watching their tactics. That consultant was actually detained by police for flying a drone without permission. He and a coach have now been sent home over this incident. The Canadian Soccer Federation issued a lengthy apology, and Canada's head coach says she'll sit out today's game. But as far as the U.S. is concerned, the biggest Olympic story of the day did not have anything to do with Paris at all.
Our world needs the Olympic and Paralympic movement now more than ever, and we will make you proud.
In the wee hours of the morning, Salt Lake City, Utah learned it will once again be the host of the Winter Olympics in 2034. That was the sound of people cheering this news at 4 a.m. local time in Salt Lake City. They got a decade to get even more amped up. But the International Olympic Committee announced a rule here that has already created a really weird vibe. Let's take it to Paris right now, where Christine Brennan is covering the games. She's a sports columnist with USA Today. She's also an ABC News contributor. Christine, can you just explain what's going on with the future Olympics?
Brad, this was crazy. Salt Lake City is really the only city that wants to host the Winter Olympics. It's getting harder and harder for the International Olympic Committee to find cities and countries that are interested. It costs so much money. It's so difficult. Obviously, climate change, all the things that we know about what it is with an Olympics. So you get a city like Salt Lake City, which hosted the 2002 Olympics and did a fabulous job. Great Olympic Games.
Those are more than just memories for the people of Utah. They are living legacies.
And this was a slam dunk. Everyone just expected it would just go without any issue, any problem.
However, there remains one open question.
Instead, several International Olympic Committee members proposed an amendment.
The IOC has reinforced the current language of the Olympic host contract in order to protect the integrity of the international anti-doping system.
And they want the U.S. to drop the FBI investigation into the Chinese doping controversy.
Yeah, I think the language was like the U.S. cannot undermine the World Anti-Doping Agency. They can't undermine WADA, which you'd think, like, why would they do that? And yet it apparently all goes back to this federal investigation of Chinese athletes. Can you brush us up on that?
We just found out about it. The New York Times and a German public broadcasting company exposed it a few months ago.
The FBI has launched a criminal investigation into 23 Chinese swimmers for doping.
Chinese swimmers, the 23 swimmers, tested positive before the Tokyo Olympics.
Chinese authorities blamed food contamination at their hotel. The World Anti-Doping Agency did not challenge that explanation and allowed the athletes to compete.
But it was never revealed. No transparency. They went to compete in Tokyo in three golds. They won 3 golds, and 11 of them, of the 23, are competing here. And so all these athletes that competed in Tokyo, including Katie Ledecky in a relay, came in second to people who had tested positive a few months earlier. That outrages the United States.
Like right now, people are just getting away with everything.
23-time Olympic gold medalist Michael Phelps endorsing a lifetime ban for any athlete caught doping.
Because of a law known as the Rodchenkov Act, it allows the U.S., in this case the FBI, to go after officials or others in a criminal manner, in criminal prosecution, who were involved in this doping scheme. They've already served a subpoena to the World Aquatics executive director, again, that's swimming, to try to figure out this doping scheme, what happened, and why the world didn't know about it.
Okay, so this is like an ultimatum that, like, you can have the games if you stop investigating this. What did U.S. organizers do?
Stunningly and amazingly, I cannot believe it. The Salt Lake City officials and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee caved.
Wow.
They caved.
We're back, baby. The Olympics are coming back to Utah. Thank you.
And so while you had Katie Ledecky an hour and a half earlier in a press conference talking about the importance of clean sport.
We're following all those rules. And again, all that we ask is that those rules are being applied fairly and consistently worldwide.
One floor and 90 minutes later, you had these officials caving in to demands from the International Olympic Committee for them to get rid of the investigation into something that Katie Ledecky, Michael Phelps just testified in front of Congress, that they care so much about.
Right. And it's interesting. The U.S. Anti-Doping Agency sounded pretty furious about this, but they sound more upset with the IOC for pressuring Salt Lake City. Local organizers, though, Christine, sounded upbeat about this. You had Utah Governor Spencer Cox yesterday defending all this.
The United States cannot clean up sport by itself. That's impossible. And conversely, WADA can't clean up sport by itself without countries that are willing to participate and work together.
But I guess I'm just confused as to why the organizers made this concession. Like, if the U.S. has been so public about wanting to go after these people and protecting their own athletes, frankly.
Because they were scared they were going to lose the Olympics otherwise.
And as we look at this issue, I'm very sympathetic to how the international sport federations feel, because they're worried, can I come to the U.S. safely? And we need to make sure that everybody feels safe.
I cannot believe that Salt Lake officials and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee didn't just say no. Now, what's going to end up happening here, I believe, is that it will be a rude awakening, because I cannot imagine Congress taking too kindly to what the U.S. Olympic Committee and the Salt Lake officials just did. And I've got to believe that if any of these officials show up and deserve to be arrested, they're going to get a knock on the door and they're going to be arrested. And so they may be the most shocked people on the planet when they thought they got this deal from Salt Lake City. So it's truly a mess. It's stunning. It's exactly the way that they did not want to kick off the Olympic week. But it is something worthy of all of our attention.
3 years after Salt Lake City won its bid to host the Olympics, came an admission today that several members of the powerful IOC were effectively bribed for their votes.
I think for a lot of people, they remember Salt Lake City and they remember the bribery scandal from 1999.
Salt Lake organizers have admitted giving relatives of IOC members nearly $400,000 in scholarships.
Once again, Salt Lake City officials are involved again in a major controversy of their own making. This is supposed to be such a positive thing, and now they're mired right back in controversy just as they were at the beginning of the century.
Wow, unbelievable. And Christine Brennan will, of course, have a column in USA Today that's out actually right now this morning. Thank you so much, Christine.
Brad, thank you.
Okay, one more quick break. When we come back, if you like Cocaine Bear, well, these creatures are the real-life sequel. One Last Thing is next.
Hey moms, looking for some lighthearted guidance on this crazy journey we call parenting?
Join me, Sabrina Kohlberg.
And me, Andy Mitchell, for Pop Culture Moms,
where each week we talk about what we're watching
and examine our favorite pop culture moms up close to try to pick up some parenting hacks along the way.
Come laugh, learn, and grow with us as we look for the best tips.
And maybe a few what not to do's from our favorite fictional moms.
From Good Morning America and ABC Audio.
Pop Culture Moms. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
And one last thing. You thought Jaws was high-strung? Try being one of these guys. This week, Brazilian scientists announced that sharks off the coast of Rio de Janeiro have noticeable amounts of cocaine in their system. In fact, they tested 13 sharks. Every single one of them had at least trace amounts. Now, before you go accusing the sharks of some nefarious drug trafficking plot, scientists say this is clearly humans' fault. The United Nations World Drug Report puts Brazil among the top consumers of cocaine on Earth, and these sharks don't migrate, so this stuff definitely comes from Rio, most likely from sewage going out into the ocean. Yeah, this is all the result of cocaine being flushed down the toilet.
This is a big deal because we're polluting our environment, right? This is a man-made product that's being put out into the ocean.
Kelsey Banks is a research scientist for the Center for Sportfish Science and Conservation at Hart Research Institute. She says when you're told to dispose of pharmaceutical drugs properly, this is why it can end up in local waterways.
It's not just a problem in the ocean. We also see this in our riverways with freshwater fish and other fish in the bays.
Now, if you have in your mind some Scarface guys dumping bricks of the stuff off their boat in the ocean, that's less of a thing in Brazil than it is, say, off the coast of Florida. So rather than scarfing the stuff, these sharks have likely been exposed to small traces of cocaine for years now. It's unclear how much this will affect them, but remember, sharks are predators. They can be swimming through foreign substances, but they can also be eating prey that's been tainted as well. We, as humans, eat some of that same seafood.
And then ultimately come back to humans, right? So these species can act as indicators for an environment that's becoming degraded.
And that, Brazilian scientists say, is why they've got their eyes on sharks for more than just cocaine. Chemicals, heavy metals, it can all find its way into the food chain, and it doesn't make a difference whether you think it's safe to go back in the water. We're going to need a bigger boat as a species. Hey, by the way, a lot of new listeners with the events of the last few weeks, so if you haven't already, make sure to hit that follow button. Subscribe to us for a new episode every morning. It'll just magically update on your phone, easy peasy. And if you're really liking the show, hit us up with a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen. You know, we're in a community, so you don't need to be like the lone shark in the big ocean. Spread the word to each other. I'm Brad Milkey. See you tomorrow.
It was the clues these victims left behind that led police to their killers.
How I Caught My Killer, the true crime phenomenon returns.
We lifted that floorboard up. Lo and behold, a trench.
With 10 all-new episodes.
Because of the screenshots he left behind, he was a hero.
It's like she was calling out to us from the grave.
I couldn't believe it.
We were shocked.
I see this.
He just recorded his own murder.
We got a serial killer off the street.
How I Caught My Killer, now streaming only on Hulu.